Welcome, everyone. I'm Ty Carr, and this is another week of the None of Our Businesses podcast and YouTube show where we talk about this week in business, accounting, finance news, maybe even some tax news once in a while. We do that all from an accountant's perspective, of course. And with me, as always, is AJ Wheeler.
How's it going?
Charlie Zigmund.
Thanks for joining us.
And Mark Pallardy.
Hey.
All right, guys, glad you're here with us. And we're going to start off this week with Mark. So, yeah, what do you have for us, Mark?
Yeah, I came across an interesting article from the Journal of Accountancy. And I know prior to my joining, you guys were talking about the PPP loans and how loans under 50,000 were no longer going to be requiring the heavy-handed paperwork. And now all of a sudden, the IRS is saying that, or the SBA is saying that PPP loans larger than 2 million are going to require some extra paperwork. There's going to be a form that's called the Paycheck Protection Program Loan Necessity Questionnaire. And I think it's interesting, and I wanted to get your opinion because I find it like maybe a little disingenuous that after a program has already begun and people didn't know it was coming. I mean, it's kind of, we've been flying by the seat of our pants with the PPP anyway. All of a sudden, there's going to be this paperwork that's going to say, why was this loan necessary? Especially when going into the pandemic, they were so quick to approve this because nobody knew what was going to happen. So here we are now at the tail end where kind of hindsight is 2020. And now all these people who took out loans over 2 million are going to have to justify why they took it. So I'm interested in what you guys think about that.
I felt similarly. I don't like it from the standpoint of it seemed like the nature of what they were after was questioning how people made their good faith certification. And, there really wasn't good guidance on how to make that good faith certification to begin with. So yeah, it just feels like a witch hunt to basically single out certain loans that are over a certain size and then go after those people for essentially potentially saying that they didn't make the good faith certification correctly, that maybe they didn't really need it. And what does that even mean anyway? It's like, if it turns out in retrospect that they didn't need it, that doesn't mean that at the beginning of this, they didn't think they needed it or that it wasn't reasonable to think that they needed it. So yeah, I think I don't like the direction that's going because, it's like, well, they can start there. And then if, do they just start lowering the limits after that and going after more of us who were rightfully scared in business back when this whole pandemic first kind of was starting and not knowing whether we were going to be able to keep things going and make our payrolls and things like that. And the government offered this stimulus opportunity, which did keep a lot of business going. And so I think, yeah, to just second guess it and Monday morning quarterback it in this way is not cool.
Yeah, I'm with you, Ty. I know that everybody that I worked with that provided that good faith certification definitely meant it at the time that they did. There was a lot of uncertainty. Like you said, the rules were not clear. And it just seems late in the game to be making that kind of change. I know that giving out I don't want to say a handout, but trying to aid the economy is a big task. But, part of doing it right is setting up all those boundaries in the beginning so that these kinds of questions are clarified up front before everybody gets, way deep in the process. What do you think, AJ?
Well, I'm wondering if the public perception of this will be different than maybe ours because of the 2 million or more in PPP loans, like that $2 million threshold that they're talking about. I wonder if that people will think, well, man, if you got 2 million in that large number, maybe as opposed has, I guess, social stigma behind it or something. Wow, that's a lot of money for a free loan to a nonprofit or a for-profit. So I wonder if the general public will see it differently than us.
The one thing I would point out about that, though, is that because so much of this was based on payroll, I mean, that doesn't mean that the organization who got a $2 million loan was necessarily very profitable or, presumably if they'd survived up to this point, they probably had over $2 million in revenue to cover that payroll. But nevertheless, I mean, there's a lot of kind of small businesses out there that have payroll runs of $2 million if they're person power heavy, right? So yeah.
Oh yeah, and actually, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, I've seen nonprofit payrolls that run 2 million, every 6 months. So, I mean, that, and they employ nonprofits are a good sector of the economy that is mostly people power. So, yeah, definitely. I would say it was just an observation on the dollar amount, though. You got an article for us, Charlie? Oh, sorry, Mark. Did you have something else? My bad.
I was going to throw it to Charlie.
Oh,
cut that shit out.
You guys don't have to fight over me. We can just roll right into that next article. All right, so I've got an article from CNBC kind of on a similar topic, coronavirus again, of course, it's that time. So the article is called Vaccine Optimism Could Feed into the Market's Biggest Near-Term Risk, says top economist. And so I'm sure people have been following the news, but in the last week, there has been a lot of excitement about potentially 90% effective COVID vaccine. And so they're working on putting that out, but that's coming out at the same time where surges, where basically the number of cases is also surging. And so economists are trying to warn people that, hey, there's a big rally, but maybe take it with a grain of salt, because at the same time, there's all these near-term fears. And so I guess I want to get your guys' take on whether or not you think what is it right to have this big of a surge in the stock market when at the same time we're having record number of cases relating to COVID? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think the stock market is tricky because it's going up and down based on what the populace at large or the market forces think the future is going to hold. I mean, we've seen throughout the elections, it goes up, it goes down based on any given piece of news. And so any good news they want to cling to, and then the stock market surges. And then when we find out that the vaccine might not be deliverable for another 6 months, then it's going to go down again. And it's tricky when, if you're a day trader or somebody who's counting on the market for any sort of stability. I don't think in this kind of event with the virus surging that there's any stability to really be found. So I think you're right, but how do you gauge it? How do you figure out what to do? I mean, I think slow and steady wins the race in this case. Anybody else?
I think we're coming up on Black Friday next week, I think, or the week after. Sorry. So I think probably the consumer shopping that happens by the end of the quarter will probably, I think, be a better measure, a better feel, at least to me, on how the economy is driving. I think it's how the consumer spending is happening. But that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that once we get through some of the bumps related to the election and bumps related to COVID news or whatever, I think that's right. Is it it may be somewhat tied to whether there's stimulus or not, right? I mean, if you've got, I think the way COVID affects the market, I think there's a more profound effect on the fact that all the people in the service industry who aren't able to work because restaurants and bars are shut down again and small retail is not operating at capacity and all of that. If they don't have the money to consume, I think that has probably a bigger impact on the economy than the direct impact of the restaurant they work at not being open itself. I think it's the fact that they don't have the money to spend, the consumer base, and that's going to be somewhat tied to news of stimulus plans, probably.
Yeah, and I think that reminded me of something else that I just heard today, Ty, that Americans are having record savings amounts because they're not going to restaurants, they're not going to movies, they're not going to all these places and concerts, etc. And they're talking about how once COVID breaks through, there could be this surge of spending from people who have been holding off on vacations, holding off from all these spending. I mean, there will be certain things like, I didn't get a haircut for 6 months. Not me personally, obviously, but if I didn't get a haircut for 6 months, I don't need 6 haircuts to make up for that. But, as we start realizing, hey, I've got some money saved up, let's take that big vacation now. I think that could be another factor that could help us out, with a little bit of a surge in the other direction.
I think that's exactly right. And I think another thing that kind of exacerbates that is when I know a lot of unemployment stuff has been building up for a while and the payments weren't being made regularly. And then a lot of times they catch up on like 10 weeks at the same time. And so I just think that puts the money into a different place in the people's minds who gets it, where they're more likely to spend it when they get a big lump sum all at once. And they've been living lean up until then. All right, so I think we've covered that topic. Do you have another topic we can talk about, AJ?
Yeah, I actually got one from CNBC here. So Deutsche Bank proposes a 5% tax for people still working from home after the pandemic has ended. So a research done by at the bank proposed that people pay a 5% tax for the privilege of working from home if they continue to do so after the pandemic. And so their case is that it would subsidize lower earners due to the coronavirus. And what that means is if they choose to work from home, they won't be like getting their dry cleaning done in the city or eating at restaurants or using taxis, using the amenities of like where the commute essentially and the lifestyle centered around being at an office. And so they proposed a 5% tax to raise money for this displacement. So I'd like to get your guys' take on that. Maybe does that sound crazy, or does that sound like, you know, a good payoff, I guess, in the short term to alleviate those people that are hurting even after the pandemic as people continue to work from home?
So, I mean, they're supposed to trade in their taxis for taxes. It makes no sense. I hate it. I don't like any part of it. I think if you're working at home, you're bearing more cost already. You're paying more electricity. You're paying all these other costs that you weren't paying. And it's a trade-off in a lot of places. And so, yeah, I think it's a bit of a silly measure in my opinion, but maybe there's something to it that I don't understand. What do you think, Mark?
You know, I think Germany, you know, kind of works on a different level as far as taking care of its citizens. And I think there's a mentality here where this 5% that they're going to charge on these people who are staying at home is supposed to go to those workers who are frontline and can't work from home. So the idea is kind of everybody get on board and let's help those people who can't. I don't know if the government is then going to give these people a 5% raise, you know, and if we're talking a bit of a redistribution of wealth. But I have a problem because it's not really costing, it might be costing some businesses money because they're not having the tax base to come in there and spending downtown. But at the same time, there's a lot of businesses that don't need to rent office space if this happens long term, or their electricity and utility bills might be lower because they're not filled up with people working out of them. And on the other side, a lot of people working from home might have higher utility bills because they're spending their own utilities to work from home. So penalizing them seems a bit arbitrary. I agree with both of you guys on this. And you know, it just seems like there should be some smarter measures rather than punishing those, especially in a green country that's so environmentally conscious like Germany. You know, this seems an environmentally conscious thing to do, and punishing those who are taking those steps seems a bit off the mark. So Charlie, how about you? Do you got another article for us?
Sure. Yeah, I've got another one we can talk about. So a lighthearted article in Accounting Today called 4 Ways to Reset Your Firm in 2021. And so what the article looks at is their idea, you know, they're looking at, hey, this the big pandemic going on. Everybody's trying to change. Everything is changing, whether we like it or not. How can we take that and reset our firm? And it's, of course, geared towards accounting firms, but I think the advice that they're giving can apply to a lot of different industries. Their advice is to rise up to meet new expectations. For them, that means to use Zoom to figure out whether or not your website is up to par and do online scheduling and that sort of thing. To move from reactive to proactive advising. And so instead of waiting for your clients to come to you for advice, you should reach out to them and determine if they are, you know, if you're solving all of their concerns or if there's maybe things they just didn't bother to reach out to you on. It says to connect your front and back office using cloud-based software so that people can more easily work from home and that sort of thing. And maybe my favorite one, build an irresistible culture. Let people work remote and have a positive atmosphere, as if there was any way that any of us could sort of, you know, say no to that. But, you know, what do you guys think? Are these the ways to reset your firm in 2021?
I mean, as somebody that came from like a paper heavy firm, I would say, of course, you probably want to allow people to work from home, especially if you're talking about tax or audit work, in a traditional accounting sense, because I think the pandemic's probably proven that you can do most of that work remotely. You know what I mean? So not allowing somebody to work from home afterwards probably wouldn't be the greatest company culture, I think, move. So that doesn't seem surprising to me. But as for the rest of it, I don't know. I'd have to defer to somebody else on that one. But definitely allowing work from home afterwards would seem like a no-brainer, I guess.
I kind of like the tone of this article because it's talking more about how the role of the CPA and the accounting firm is moving from just being somebody who does your taxes or to somebody who's becoming a trusted advisor and being able to go in there. And I really like the step from going from reactive to proactive advising, to offering more client services, to kind of being the business associate that you can be, as opposed to just being the guy who does your taxes or the guy who does your audit. And since we are going to be connecting in more technologically advanced ways, and we might not be in the office at all times anymore, being that proactive advisor that we can be, a resource rather than just somebody who punches numbers into a calculator, seems to be the right track to take for the future of business.
And along those lines, on that exact point of being more proactive rather than reactive, I would use that to plug the kind of the methodology that we've put forward on this show before, which is for as professionals to be more like doctors who are diagnosing client issues and prescribing, trying to figure out what the solutions are, rather than just commodity providers who just execute a service that the client comes to you specifically to execute, right? And you can think about, obviously, sometimes those things align. If a client comes to you to prepare a tax return, they in fact probably need the tax return done. There's no question there that has to happen at some point. And so that's fine. But I know, like, if you think about audits, sometimes it's true with audits too, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have clients that ask CPAs for audits or other kinds of assurance services. And if you dig more to really understand the objective that they're trying to achieve, you might discover that it's not actually an audit they need. Maybe they're able to get a lower service if they just talk to whoever's asking them for it. Like maybe it's a bank and the bank's willing to go with a review instead of an audit, or maybe they're able to not do it all together if the client thought it was necessary, but it turned out it wasn't really, and you're helping them really figure out what it is they really need before you just jump in and fulfill whatever they kind of on the surface level asked for. Because if all you do is kind of fulfill the wants of clients at the surface level, what they ask for, you are putting yourself in the commodity zone. You're just one of many providers who can basically fill that want, and you're not being proactive and helping understand what the client's underlying objectives are and advising them on what their options are. So I think if you really take on that mantle, that responsibility, that kind of extreme ownership of work with your clients in terms of thinking about what are their objectives, what are they trying to achieve, even if it may be that what they want me to do isn't, in my professional opinion, isn't actually going to get them what they're trying to achieve. And that may create some initial conflict. But I think if you take that responsibility on, it positions you better to be proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to take a reactive stance here, kind of like you said, just implies that the client knows what they're looking for or what they actually need. And that's often not the case if they're seeking help. So, all right. Do you have another article we can talk about, Mark?
You bet. This is maybe a little more of a cautionary tale, but I came across this and thought it was interesting. From Accounting Today, GoFundMe donations may have tax consequences. Now, some of you may be saying, well, duh, but I think a lot of us probably have clients who have given to GoFundMes and then tried to write those GoFundMe donations off as charitable deductions. Or on the other side, people who are getting money through a GoFundMe campaign think, well, I'm just getting gifts from everybody, so I don't have any tax consequences. Well, apparently the IRS is getting wise to this, because there's been 120 million GoFundMe donations up to recently, with over $9 billion in funding. And the IRS has never said no to a source of funding when possible. So I think it's just a cautionary tale to realize that if you're giving to somebody who, through Facebook or wherever, where they're in need of some money and they're doing it through a GoFundMe platform, if it's not a certified charity, if it doesn't say anywhere that it's 501c3, you probably shouldn't be taking that as a write-off on your tax return as an itemized deduction. So I don't know that there's much to discuss here, but I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, I just think it makes sense that there's a distinction between a charitable donation that serves some kind of higher purpose versus what is essentially a gift. I realize that a lot of the people who are setting up GoFundMes don't view that as necessarily a gift. They're viewing it as, to them, it's a higher purpose. But, the reality is that a charitable organization like a nonprofit goes through a lot of steps and work to get that certification. And so to kind of set that all aside so that a bunch of friends can give money to someone in need is just doesn't seem like the intent of nonprofit law or of the charitable contribution law. So yeah, what do you guys think?
Well, for sure, what you just said is true in the sense of, I mean, that's something that as a tax advisor early on in my career that I face a lot is there is no provision in tax law that allows you to deduct giving to individual people in a charitable fashion. So even if you found somebody who was needy on the street, homeless in the cold, and you provided the funds to bring them in or clothe them or whatever, they're not a charity. That's not a qualified charity for a qualified tax deduction. And so I think that is an item, even outside the GoFundMe context, that is sometimes misunderstood, is that even though your intent may be charitable, the charitable deduction has a very specific technical requirement that it's being given to a qualified, something that is identified as a tax-exempt qualified charitable organization by the IRS. But it's interesting because I don't know too much about GoFundMe, but what I've seen over the years is that it's used in different ways, right? So, we've narrowed in on the way in which it might be used for kind of charitable intent, but it's also used by small businesses or projects to basically get off the ground with raising money. And if I remember right, I think there's like different ways it can be formatted, where in some cases the patrons literally get nothing promised to them, and in other cases they are buying into something that they will get, eventually, when the project comes to fruition, they'll get something out of it. So I think, all that's to say is that not all GoFundMes are created equal in terms of how they might be accounted for and how they might be taxed. And I think it is probably a complex area that you probably do need a tax advisor, whether to determine whether it's charitable, to determine whether in a business context the nature of it is more equity, or determine in a business context whether the nature of it is a business expense or a business revenue or whatever. So I think there's a lot of possibilities there, and they probably have to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis.
All right. So our next article is actually talking about Gary Vaynerchuk, and actually he's launching, I guess, a new consulting service. So probably no surprise to anybody. He has a new business segment, and so he's a serial entrepreneur. But what I thought was interesting and why I picked it for the podcast was that I think it kind of is back to what Ty was talking about, being like an assassin or a doctor. But essentially, he says he's left millions of dollars on the table, and dozens of big brands were asking him on advice for reaching young consumers. So he decided to, and then the media company and creative company didn't offer that. They were more doing like what you would think of like a long-term contract for media strategy. And so he decided that he would launch this. And so it's a consulting service is what he's talking about. But essentially it's a roadmap to reach younger viewers and through strategic partnerships. And in these last anywhere from 6 months or something like that to 12 months. But I thought it was interesting, to kind of contrast it to the accounting world where you're talking about a big consulting gig or you're talking about doing very small engagements, Anyway, I'd like to get your guys' take on that.
Well, I would just one point of clarification. I've never accused our colleagues of being assassins, so it wasn't a the paradigm of a. I think I've said, are you a doctor versus a mercenary?
Oh, I had the whole.
I took that.
I got you.
But I like it. I like it. Yes, I think I've never accused them directly, but perhaps that's a form of mercenary that some of our colleagues in fact are. I mean, there was that movie, The Accountant, right? So maybe so,
AJ's our Ben Affleck, I guess.
Yeah, that was his face.
Well, I think this model is really interesting. I mean, obviously he's trying to appeal to Gen Z and those who are heavily invested in using social media, and his gigs aren't cheap. In order to get your company kind of up there and ready, I think it said he was charging between 250 grand and 500,000, and the work is 8 to 12 weeks. So not a bad gig if you can get it, but he's got a lot of companies lining at the door to figure out how to reach the younger generation. And I think you need somebody media savvy in order to do that. So if he's finding the clients to do this, great. I just, I worry that everything is going to kind of start to have this generic flavor as we start seeing this marketing kind of spread around and everything starts to sound the same.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think partnering with people who he thinks will appeal to Gen Z is a wise move. I think it's a wiser move than what seemed to be his previous answer, which was the cartoons. If you followed Gary Vee, you know that he's quite a fan of the cartoons. And so, yeah, I think this is maybe a more direct approach to that. And we'll see how it goes. Yeah, I've got one more we can talk about. So a little more serious article, but I found an article in the New York Times entitled "Biden's Policy Agenda Rests Heavily on Senate Outcome." And so, of course, if anybody's following the news or just breathing air, you know that President-elect Biden has, been nominated. And so now there's going to be a big Senate runoff in Georgia in January that's going to decide whether or not there's a Democratic majority in the Senate. And so I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about basically whether or not, a lot of the plans that he's laid out are very ambitious. And I think that those will have to be reined in quite a bit if there is not a majority. And so I wanted to talk about whether or not any of the things that you've heard in his plans so far are realistic, or if they're actually just anchoring, knowing that there's going to be a lot more pushback from Republicans as we get further into his presidency.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I've been listening to quite a bit of election coverage, and the way some states voted in this election, where they kept a Republican senator in their state, but yet they voted for a $15 minimum wage. It feels like the populace at large is really interested in keeping a divided government and keeping Joe Biden at his word that he's going to build bridges and work between the two parties. And I think handing him the blue wave that everybody was expecting and that the pollsters frankly all got wrong was something that society at large, market forces, didn't particularly want. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Georgia turns out. But I don't imagine, given the nature of the way the rest of the states voted, that we're looking at a runaway Democratic Congress, and even the House lost Democratic members. So, it's going to be a real testament to see if Joe Biden can put his money where his mouth is and really bring the sides together and work on things like infrastructure and other things that both sides of the aisle are interested. A stimulus would be great, that both sides of the aisle can really get behind. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see Joe Biden just really go big and really put out there a really big, ambitious plan, knowing that I probably won't even agree with or want much of what would be in that plan. But I think that it could inspire and engage the citizenry in a really great way. And so kind of, I want to see the conflict. I want to see him really put out something that is big and bold and then have to compromise down to something that's practical. But I would rather see that than for him to just start straight out of the gate with stuff that is kind of very boring and vanilla that he kind of knows he'll get past Mitch McConnell and other people on compromise right away. So I think it's kind of a counterintuitive desire of mine, I guess, in that regard. But I think that the reason for boldness is not because I think it would get passed or that I would even agree with everything that would be in such a bold plan coming from the left per se, but that I think that it would inspire the country to have a leader who has bold plans, period. And bold plans that are kind of a different variety than the bold plans of the leader we've had in the last 4 years. so that's kind of my thought on it. And yeah, one encouraging thought that might be the direction they go is I was listening to an article this morning about when Joe Biden came in with the Obama administration and was working on the economic recovery when they first came in back in, what was that, 2008 or 2009? Or was that 2010 actually? Yeah, I forget the years now. But anyway, somebody will correct me and tell me I'm way off. But anyway, when they first came in, Joe Biden was tasked with kind of figuring out economic recovery measures to propose. And he told his team, let's not die on a small cross, because the other side's going to disagree with us and say no to almost everything we come up with anyway. So we may as well be bold about this. So I'd love to see him take the same approach now, because I think that's totally the case, and no reason to be boring with his approach at this point.
I just want to hear some more off mic cursing from Biden. That's what I want. Like the F word that's kind of far away, that thinks it's off. That's just my favorite.
I will admit, I do enjoy that as well.
I haven't heard that. Maybe we need to meme it up or something. Okay, so I got one last article from Accounting Today, and it's called "Forget About LIFO and FIFO. Your new job is NIFO, NIFO." And this is not about inventory, nor is it about stabbing your colleagues. Basically, this acronym that they're coming up with is nose in, fingers out. And it kind of goes back to the article we were talking about previously about giving advice and advice and consent, if you will, to your clients. But fingers out meaning don't micromanage. Don't try to be the CPA or the firm that goes in or even try to be the CFO who goes in there and wants to do everything or have everything run through their office, because when that happens, then you become kind of the log jam, if you will, and nothing else can get done. So have some trust in the people around you, kind of create an environment where people are empowered to make decisions, put your nose in, give your advice, but keep your fingers out. And I really enjoy this mentality, having worked in places where micromanagement is a dominant work strategy. And, everything does come to a grinding halt when something is waiting for an approval or waiting for, the blessing of the person who's doing this activity. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been varieties of this idea has been a hot topic with the pandemic, because, it's become difficult for people to micromanage with people working remotely and working from home. It's not, I think we've also talked about on this show that technology could enable it for people to micromanage as well. So I think what's made micromanagement difficult is just the sudden shift, and people's patterns aren't adapted to kind of the new work environment. And so I think it's forced people to have to be less micromanagers and people to consider operating in those ways. Yeah, I aspire to not be a micromanager. I feel like most of the time I'm not. But I think it's a tough balance, because I think where I fall down on this issue is that I end up on the far ends of the spectrum. Like I end up in being so hands off and not nose in. My hands aren't in and my nose isn't in, and that's problematic. Or I end up going entirely the other direction and being very hands on. And so I think trying to figure out where that happy medium is always been a challenge for me, and I wonder if that's a challenge for everyone else as well.
Actually, when I first heard NIFO, I thought it was some sales scheme that I had never heard not in, first out, But but then when I read the article, it always reminded me of the micromanagers that I've known over my work history. And I remember they were all of them never had time. They were always felt like they were extra busy. And the reason they were extra busy is because they were essentially doing everybody else's work for them, with them, And so I think, but then Ty's right. There's also the other side of that where they just set you loose. You'll figure it out, like learning to ski for the first time, and they just take you to the top of the mountain and like point you down. And like by the time you get down, you'll figure it out. So I think there's like a good balance between mentorship and teaching and showing somebody, but then having the trust, but verifying after they've learned their job. And it also probably depends on where people are in their careers. But I think management is one of those things. I think it's much more like a coach in a sports team. You treat everybody differently. Some people need more close management. Some people just are, flourish if they're allowed to do what, they do best, and you let loose with them. But I think everybody, from a management standpoint, how you manage people, I think is a person to person kind of decision.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a really fine line to cross, and I think it depends on kind of the skill differential between you and the person if someone's managing you. But it's like it's all in what you don't know. If that person knows something that you don't know, and then you try to micromanage them, you don't come out with the same outcome because you didn't allow them to kind of flourish. And so, I think it's really kind of, if you're going to choose to micromanage, you're basically taking a gamble that you know better how the task needs to be performed, and to an extent that is big enough of a difference that it also makes sense for you to spend the time explaining to them how to do whatever it is. And so I think that's not often the case. I'm more a fan of just let people approach the problems in the way that they would. And I'm also not a big fan of the nose in, fingers out name, because what am I supposed to name my band now? No ideas, right? Nobody has any ideas. So yeah,
None that I can mention without getting the podcast demonetized, but you
can't top that,
right? Whose article is it? Is it yours or mine, Charlie?
Nope.
You're the only one left, AJ.
Oh, am I? Okay. All right. Last article is actually an interesting one that I read out of the New York Times, and we saved from last week because we had too many. But essentially, it's how to keep climbing the ladder while you're working from home. So the author actually goes really in depth, and like I suggest, we have links in the description, but I suggest somebody goes through and reads it because I think it does a good job of like kind of giving that like postgraduate or first part of the career, so you're 20 or 30 somethings kind of trying to level up in your career, a good way to manage the pandemic and after pandemic work from home, remote kind of world we're living in now. So I'll go through the kind of like the checklist she has. So seek feedback, and that's asking how you're doing, if you can do better, and then, getting feedback from them. Level up your skills. So if you have extra time to learn a new thing or go to, for our industry, for instance, Charlie has Excel videos. If you got extra time and you got downtime right now during the pandemic, learn some new Excel functions.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah. Interactions, ask good questions in meetings, look engaged, lean in, that kind of thing, and ask, poignant questions if you have them. Get exposure. So one of the things they talk about is getting out of your department and working with somebody else in a different department, or expanding your skill set. Managers, learn how to level up your team, be flexible, have a goal in mind of what you want to do in your career, and kind of pace yourself towards that, and then find an advocate within the system. But I'm wondering, maybe you guys have any insight on, leveling up your career or moving through the career path, up in the career path in the new remote world we've had.
I think being very collaborative in your approach is helpful right now in the sense, and I'm acutely aware of it because I don't think that I'm inherently that collaborative myself. So I kind of have to work on it sometimes, but I see like, I think that, and what I mean by that is a lot of times you might get a task, and particularly for us as accountants, you might get something where you think, well, I can just do this, and you just do it, and then you kind of throw it out there to whoever it is you have to throw it out there, and you don't necessarily like engage other people in the organization to discuss what you're doing. And I think that when you're working at home like this, it's probably good to do that. I mean, you obviously, you also don't want to overdo that in a way that seems disingenuous or that you're just wasting people's time. But I think that making those connections and running things by other people and getting their feedback on it, reminding them that you're working with them on things, because they don't see you in the office every day anymore, is probably a helpful thing to do, rather than just kind of quietly doing your work and then turning it in, without much kind of interaction with people. I think being more collaborative, interactive in how you do your work would serve people more right now, in this particular setting.
Yeah, I actually really like this article, AJ. And one of the things that stuck with me, because I hear it all the time from all my friends about how burnt out they are. And all their workplaces are piling more and more stuff on them because they're the responsible one, they're the reliable one. And within this article, it says burned out employees can't sustain high quality output, and they're the most likely to leave because they're the most talented and they have the best options elsewhere. So, if you're not paying attention and you're just, utilizing your staff to their maximum limits without considering what the circumstances are, you could lose very good employees, and then where are you at? So I think everything AJ and Ty said is correct, and I think we are in a new paradigm, so we might as well utilize that to think about the workplace within that paradigm.
I don't have much to add. I just want to say I agree. I'll say that working with a wider variety of people in the last year or two has caused me to realize that there are a lot of other viewpoints that I don't always consider until somebody maybe brings them to my attention. And so I think collaborating with people, even when you feel like maybe you know the answer, it will often cause you to realize that there's just a whole other perspective on issues that maybe you didn't consider. And it maybe doesn't change your outcome of how you were going to go about things, but it helps you think more broadly about issues. And so I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it made me when I read the article originally, it made me think about like I guess our work environment, and wanting to re-engage with my client, or not re-engage, but have transparency with the clients and reevaluate where we're at in the reaching of goals and how we're going to reach those goals. And then, making sure that we're still on a timetable that makes sense and is doable. Just all those things kind of flushed in when I was reading the article. And so and evaluating, how projects are going on an ongoing basis, I think is really important. And like Ty's talking about, being collaborative with it, being able to share with not only the client, but with our team, you know what I mean? What's going on, I guess, from, is this correct? Working in like a buddy system regarding things, I think is super helpful. And having somebody check what you're doing and making sure that the product that's going out is acceptable to the client, I think is always a good thing. So.
Yeah, I think you bring up a kind of a different area that I want to speak to in terms of, if you're dealing in client service, I think having touch points with your clients that basically force that collaboration is a good idea, because I think in this environment, it could be very easy. The danger is to become very transactional. Client hires me to do X, I do X, I deliver, done. There wasn't a lot of communication with the client, perhaps, right? And so I think that you could kind of really, in this environment that we're in, you could really narrow in on that and become very transactional in how you operate. And I think that there's a danger to that, in terms of being able to develop as a professional and grow your business and just holistically do well. So I think I think I would encourage service providers to consider how they structure their engagements so that it isn't just that they're delivering X, that there are touch points where there is some intentional collaboration with their clients.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of the None of Our Businesses podcast. Be sure to join us next week for another roundtable discussion from an accountant's perspective. See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you guys.